While Konami's iconic Castlevania franchise has usually been met with critical praise and excellent sales, the recent explosion of the Metroidvania genre among indies has brought a new spotlight on this exciting offspring of 2D action platformers. The objective of Berzerk Studio, a Quebec-based developer, is an 8-bit love letter to the early days of the franchise, delivering an open-ended yet old-school game of battles, platforming, and plenty of player agency. This is the XboxEra review for Infernax. This 2D single-player title puts the player into the boots of a respected knight, with the unenviable task of stopping a demonic invasion of the kingdom, eradicating enemies across towns, roads, castles, sewers, and so on. As anticipated, this happens in a typical Metroidvania fashion. You can see most areas from the start, but reaching them may need a skill or move that's not yet been unlocked, thus requiring plenty of backtracking and revisiting prior areas. Enemies also respawn when you go back, but at least they keep giving the XP and coins to the player for some favorable farming. The core gameplay too is very reminiscent of action games of old. No, not the violent shootouts of Contra and the likes, but the relatively short-range attacks via swords, maces, etc. that push back enemies, allowing the player to step back and forth in short-lived encounters that wouldn't feel too out of place in a fencing competition. Ranged attacks are a rarity, with only a handful of magic attacks allowing for such damage, and in between battles, expect a large variety of platforming segments, with classics such as moving platforms, spikes, rotating wheels to balance on, and bottomless pits to avoid. Infernax takes pride in its main source of inspiration of the NES era, with titles like Castlevania 2, Simon's Quest, and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde serving as the main sources of inspiration with their convoluted exploration segments, a day-night system that changes the monsters roaming the lands, and so on. There's even a quite hilarious callback to the infamous part in Simon's Quest, where the player, with no hint whatsoever, needs to crouch in a specific corner for about 10 seconds, only to be taken away by a hurricane. It's an approach very reminiscent of Shovel Knight, with which it also shares much of the character progression. Every enemy killed can give the player EXP and coins, even after repeated kills. This offers a way to conveniently farm if one were to find the game a tad difficult and needed an extra hand. And the game can be quite unapologetic at times. Not only can certain enemies and boss fights take massive chunks of health away with each hit, but there's also plenty of pits, lava pools, and even water that, when touched, is instantaneous death. On the normal difficulty, players don't get more than a few extra lives at any given time. When they expire, it's back to the closest save point, which can be various screens back. However, in many ways, Infernax feels more confined by the rules and designs of the era. Many quests feel rather convoluted, making it unclear what needs to be done to progress the story. This, in turn, leads to a lot of backtracking and plenty of trial and error, since there's only a single option to progress. The number of enemies and placement often feel rather sadistic and not particularly well designed, as the pushback of a single hit between moving platforms almost automatically results in an unavoidable death. Skills, such as a deadly thunderstorm, exist to try and clear the screen, but the mana pool is limited, and for the most part, players will need to get close and personal via melee attacks, which is a huge risk at times. The game is, at least, rather generous in its item and power management. Players get to unlock stronger and stronger weapons and armors, can continuously increase the maximum health, mana, and base damage via upgrades bought via XP, and there's also an increasing amount of slots that can be unlocked to hoard regenerating potions, on top of several skills aimed at restoring health or restoring damage resistance. There are even extra lives that are always reset at save points. Some particularly annoying bosses, and the castle that leads to them, can be dealt with a lot easier with all of this assistance, though the instant death scenario, such as pitfalls and lava, remain lethal either way. The game's campaign, which spans about 8 hours, takes the player throughout several towns. Equipment and skills can be bought at shops. Inns can be used for sleeping, which serves both as a regeneration of health and mana, and as a day-night toggle, and several NPCs can give outside quests in exchange of loot. Interestingly enough, at various points throughout the campaign, the player gets to choose what to do, whether to kill or spare a mysterious creature, whether to stay loyal to one side or make a deal with some bandits, and so on. All of these decisions come back to impact later in-game events and storylines, with even multiple endings to the game that vary depending on our deeds as a knight. I don't think that revisiting said story branches is truly worth the effort though. The game features plenty of backtracking as it is. The respawning enemies in the save point system will likely put the player through the same areas plenty of times anyway. Indeed, before the end credits roll, the game had already started losing a bit of steam. The game's visuals, however, deserve a bit of extra praise. While mostly staying faithful to the style and possibilities of the 8-bit NES aesthetics, there are a couple things that you really wouldn't see in that era. Enemies break into dozens of gibs and blood splatters, often soaking the protagonist in red. More importantly, there's some slightly animated storyboard sequences that are highly detailed, yet still in the 8-bit style, and these are reminiscent of the splash screens of games on the NES. The music also feels straight out of that era, and while it's generally pleasant to listen to during combat, there's not really any standout track I would mention, even after many hours in the game. What often makes or breaks difficult platforming games is the precision of the controls and the reliability of the in-game logic. Unfortunately, Infernax does have a few hiccups in this area. Moving platforms and rotating wheels presented a couple inconsistent landings. Add this to the annoying pushback of enemies, who occasionally seem to hit me after my weapon quite inexplicably missed them, from shockingly low distances. Fortunately, I only encountered such issues only a handful of times during my review process. Infernax tries, and for the most part, succeeds at replicating what made the classic 8-bit Castlevania titles so beloved, making a conscious decision of ignoring the improvements of the 16-bit era, while also implementing a few more modern progression elements. The result isn't the most unique game ever, and a handful of design choices left me slightly puzzled. But what matters is that the game is fun, rewarding, and polished enough to appeal both to aging fans of the genre and newcomers alike, although the latter group may find the difficulty a tad overwhelming at times.